A new African Carbon Markets Initiative, that's in short ACMI, has been launched at the ongoing Climate Change Summit in Egypt, which aims to support the growth of carbon credit production and create jobs in Africa. Carbon markets offer an incredible opportunity to unlock billions for climate finance needs and African economies while expanding energy access, creating jobs, protect biodiversity, and driving climate action. However, Africa currently produces only a tiny percentage of its carbon credit potential. The initiative intends to promote demand for existing credits or those already in development, as well as for products and innovative projects types that do not yet have a market and can substantially contribute to economic prosperity, livelihoods, and environmental preservation across the continent. Now, let's talk more about this, and I'm being joined via Zoom by Dr. Andrew Nevin. He's the chief economist and partner with PricewaterhouseCoopers Nigeria. Joins me from Abuja. Thank you so much, Dr. Nevin. It's good to see you.
Hello, it's always a great pleasure to be with you.
A lot of talk around energy transition here, but I want to ask you, how prepared do you think Africa is for this?
Well, I mean, I think that we all understand we need to go to the energy transition. I think the issue in Africa is that we're being punished by climate change, and we didn't cause climate change. So, I mean, I think everyone understands that the emissions of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from Africa are essentially negligible, on a historical basis, negligible. The big emitters are the US, India, China, the EU, and as a result, we're having climate change, climate damage, more volatile weather. So we are the victims of climate change, but we haven't been the beneficiaries of industrialization. So I think it's an extremely unfair situation for Africa.
So what do you think about the African Carbon Markets Initiative that was inaugurated? How well do you think this will help address some of these challenges?
Well, I think I'm not really sure in a way. I mean, people need to remember, I mean, what's this all about? So if you have a company in Germany that pollutes and it's being asked to reduce its pollution, its carbon emissions, rather than reducing its carbon emissions, it goes and buys the right to carbon emissions by this trading system, this carbon offset system, carbon credit system. So in effect, what is happening is the projects in Africa that reduce carbon or prevent carbon from being released. So for example, a community moves from burning wood or cooking to burning a cleaner fuel, creates these credits, and these credits are then sold to the polluter. And I think there's a lot of questions people have. I mean, in some level, economists have argued it makes it more economically efficient. But I think you could also ask yourself, well, why would you allow the polluter to actually not reduce their emissions and being able to offset with these projects? So that's the negative side. On the positive side, I mean, we have the ability to create lots of projects that create these carbon credits and other types of credits. I think that will come along. So, for example, protecting biodiversity. And I think that the leaders of it, which includes, of course, the Vice President, His Excellency Professor Osinbajo, it also includes Dr. Adeshina, who's the CEO of AFDB. They were part of the core committee leading this, have said that this is actually a way to help in the finance the climate transition. I think the number in the report, the roadmap that was put out this week at COP27, said that Africa could earn up to $500 billion a year from properly constructed carbon credits. I'm not sure if you quoted or whether I just was doing my research a little bit earlier, but we're only capturing about 2% of the potential carbon credits from Africa. And there's lots of innovative projects that we can execute in Africa that can earn income for the people that are executing it, for the people that are overseeing it and making the integrity. So I think there are negatives with carbon credits, but I think there's also the potential for generating a significant amount of income for Africans from them.
I'm seeing it. It looks very good here. We are talking transition. We're talking creating jobs, make a lot of credit and all of that. But I'm thinking now, I'm one of those that believe that we need proceeds from crude oil to transit. Is that right or wrong?
Well, I think so. That's the climate justice question, and I think you're exactly right. So we have a situation for historical reasons that the countries I mentioned, the developed countries and China and India as well, have produced most of the world, are producing most of the world's emissions, and historically, certainly in case of the United States and Europe, produce the most historical emissions. And that they have the biggest infrastructure that's producing, and of course, Middle East countries as well, countries like Russia who are producing these hydrocarbons. And in a sense, we are locked out from increasing our hydrocarbon production because of the drive to climate change, hard to get financing for it. And at a certain level, I think it's very clear that's very unfair. And again, the vice president has been very vocal on this issue, has been clear that said, look, we understand that globally we need to reduce the amount of fossil fuels that we burn. But the way that should work is the countries that have created the problem should be reducing the amount they burn faster and giving room for countries in Africa to at least participate in this transition by earning money from their oil and gas during the time. And I think there's a lot of strong moral arguments for that, whether we're able to affect that. So that in a sense, practically what it would mean, for example, is we could go up to 3 million barrels a day producing oil, producing much more gas, which Europe wants. And simultaneously, the total amount of oil produced around the world will go down because countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia would reduce their oil production to offset us. But whether practically we can make this happen is really the big question out there. But from a moral viewpoint, you're exactly right.
A big one indeed. I'm also thinking around turning gas into our transition fuel and use as a catalyst for industrialization. What do you make around that? Gas now, focus.
Yeah, so I think the federal government of Nigeria did a very good thing about maybe 3 years ago, 2019. We all lose track of time with COVID, but in 2019, really came to the conclusion that we were a gas country, not an oil country. And the amount of gas is basically infinite in the country. One of the largest amount of gas of any country, maybe Canada, Venezuela may be higher. But anyway, and we've had some success. We're up to Train 7 in LNG, and we do export to Europe, particularly to Portugal and Spain. But with what's happened in Russia and Ukraine, and illustrating that Europe doesn't want to be dependent on can't be dependent on Russian gas after what's happened, there is a real opportunity for us to produce both the gas for export, but also gas for domestic purposes. Again, we would get carbon credits for it because if we're replacing, say, burning wood for cooking with gas for cooking, that would be considered reducing greenhouse emissions. So it ties into what we were discussing earlier with the African carbon credit market. The problem is a couple of problems with it. One is that unfortunately we have most of the gas that we have is what's called associated gas, which means that the gas is a byproduct of taking the oil out, which means we also need to increase oil production to get the gas out. There's a term unassociated gas, so the gas is just on its own, but geologically, I understand most of our gas is associated gas, so that presents a challenge. The second challenge, unfortunately, is that people around the world, because of this carbon decarbonization, it's more and more difficult to get investment. I mean, these are large-scale investments. I mean, each train is billions of dollars at LNG. We don't have that sufficient resources domestically for that. We have to get foreign capital. But increasingly, because of what's happening with climate change, foreign capital doesn't want to invest in fossil fuels, even gas. And gas was something that Europe said it wouldn't invest in. Now, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think the situation has changed somewhat. And it should be possible for us to get European governments and companies to support investments here so we can grow the gas. And as you said, there's enough gas to both grow our domestic economy, domestic industrialization, gas to power infrastructure, and export the gas to help solve Europe's energy security challenges.
Getting more interesting now, but staying with Nigeria, I'm worried if this plan, all of this transition plan, is enough to navigate the risks involved in fossil fuel dependent economy as we move towards move away from fossil fuel. Is this plan enough to help Nigeria navigate the risks involved now?
Well, I mean, we put out the paper recently on brain capital, and many people are saying this as well. I mean, our biggest resource is human capital. It really isn't fossil. Even if we grow fossil fuels somewhat, particularly the gas infrastructure, it's not going to come anywhere close to the potential we have with human capital. I mean, to put some numbers on it, the world has 28 million software developers. It's going to 45 million software developers. I mean, we put out a number. We think we should have 1.2 million software developers in the country, not leaving, not JAPA. If we have that people in software development at that scale, it'll dwarf what we can earn from oil and gas. So we're perfectly capable of making the transition into a more human capital driven, brain capital driven kind of economic situation. As I said, I think gas can be beneficial, but it's not absolutely necessary from an economic viewpoint. We can earn enough export proceeds from brain capital without the gas. That said, I still think the gas as a transition foil would be very useful both to export to Europe and solidify our economic and diplomatic relations with the European countries who are also democracies, as well as driving the fuel transition here in Nigeria. But I don't think we're as dependent on fossil fuels as you say.
Very, very, very interesting, because I was thinking that this transition plan could be better improved on. But let's stay a bit with gas, because I'm also interested in our gas reserves and how we can harness it, particularly at this time with what is happening in Russia and Ukraine, and we can go on and on with that. But the infrastructure remains one worry for me, and we see the CBN coming one way or the other. I think there was this fund again to support this sector. All in all, how well have we done in taking advantage of gas? Even at home, some people can't cook with gas because it's on the high side. That's LPG, on the other hand.
Well, as I said, I mean, I think it's very sad because, as I said a little earlier, most of the gas we produce is associated gas, which means you've got oil production and the gas production. And I think everyone listening today understands what's happened with oil production. I mean, we produce less than, if I understand right, less than 1 million barrels a day, I think, in September, which is just a tragedy for the nation, which also meant we produce less gas. So we're not producing, even with the 7 trains we have, we're not producing the amount of gas we should because it's associated with the oil production. The oil production has gone down for all the reasons people understand around security and oil theft on that. So if we actually want to build up our exports for Europe as well as the domestic need for industrialization, the quickest way, because of course it takes a long time to develop a gas field, I mean 4 or 5 years at a minimum, even if we went very quickly with in the dire circumstances. But the quickest way to increase gas production is actually to get the oil production back up, which has all the issues around security and theft and corruption that people are familiar with. But if the government or the next administration can start to make progress there, if we got 1.2, 1.4, 1.6, I mean, when I arrived in this country, we were producing over 2 million barrels a day. If we managed to get close to that, it would make a significant difference. Of course, also with our balance of payments. I mean, oil's at $85, and yet we're still suffering from an FX shortage. But the only way to get more gas in the short term is to get more oil because of this issue with associated gas.
So apart from getting this carbon credits that this initiative will open up to, what else do you think Nigeria should be taking away from COP27?
Well, I have to say, I personally am very discouraged about it. Those who've listened to me over the years know that the climate change issue is one that I follow closely. I mean, and there's certainly been progress in terms of young people around the world really making it the top issue. So that gives some reason for optimism. But, we've made these targets before. We made the Paris Accord in 2015. There were all sorts of promises last year, COP26 in Glasgow, that haven't been fulfilled. And people have given excuses around COVID and around economic challenges, recession coming to the UK and Europe, for example. I mean, we really feel like we're going backwards. And of course, in COP27, I mean, this COP, the Secretary General of the UN and said, look, we are going on a highway to hell. That was the term that he used, with climate change, and we're putting our foot on the accelerator. So rather than making any progress towards the commitments that were made, whether the commitments in terms of emissions or in terms of transition funding, particularly for developing nations, it hasn't come true. And we have governments around the world, I'll cite the UK government, the Conservatives, who are absolutely not committed to this, despite the fact that we had seen 40-degree temperatures in London, which are records. This isn't a country where there's no air conditioning. I mean, you get excess deaths, incredible hardship in that sort of situation. You also have a drought in England. I mean, for those of us who spent time in England, many of your viewers, you would sort of think to yourself, well, England is, you expect it to rain, and yet they have drought conditions. I mean, all of this is no accident. And yet, despite the fact they're suffering personally, it's a great deal in the United Kingdom, and they're not on board for this. Even though they led Glasgow COP, they didn't really make much progress. And I think that's one example. Australia was a real laggard in terms of addressing the issues. They've had a change in government, and they're much more switched on to the climate emergency. But of course, the big elephant in the room, or the big challenge for us, is we have the two largest emitters, the two largest economies really at loggerheads, so China and the United States. So over the security issues, over economic rivalry, over Hong Kong, Xinjiang province, et cetera. And people have come out and said, well, we get all those things, but actually we need the United States and China to cooperate on the climate issue. If they don't lead together, we are going to have ecological disaster around the planet, which is going to affect all of humanity. Now, fortunately, I think there is an effort on both countries' parts to recognize that if they don't work together, they're going to assure that the entire planet's destruction on that. So I think we'll come out of COP with a little bit of momentum on that. But overall, all of these COPs, I mean, we're up to COP 27. The science has become very clear. Even more than the science becoming clear, people are experiencing this. So people around the world are seeing weather patterns change, become more extreme, whether it's the hurricanes late in the season in Florida, devastating hurricanes, whether it's the fact that Europe's had incredible drought and drying up of major rivers like the Rhine and the Elbe, or in China, the rivers drying up, or in Australia, where you tend to think of wildfires, intense flooding, the flooding we've had in our own country, which has displaced, I think, 7 million people. Pakistan, 1/3 of the country underwater. I mean, these are things that didn't happen 10, 20, 50 years ago. And it's because we scientifically have shown that when you put more carbon in, you get these effects of more volatile weather and a hotter planet on that. So it's been discouraging. On the other hand, as I said a little earlier, I think the one encouraging thing is I think young people get it, and they realize that the economic model we put in place is not fit for purpose. If it destroys the planet, what's the purpose of having a high GDP? So I think as we transition to the next generation and taking over political leadership in country after country, we actually are going to make more progress. But for the last 10, 15 years, I have to say I'm pretty discouraged.
If we can just do this in 1 minute, I'm thinking that whoever wants to be the next CEO of Nigeria, apart from thinking about economy, security, business environment, we now have to include climate change. What should they really pay attention to with regards to that?
Well, I think there's a couple of major things. I mean, one is the climate reparations, climate justice. I mean, I said the vice president's been very vocal around this issue, which is Nigeria and Africa did not cause the climate crisis, did not cause the climate emergency, yet we're suffering it. And there's a moral imperative to be able to get reparations, to get funding, to be able to make the transition and build in resiliency. So I think that's one issue. I think if I was going to give one positive COP27, that issue is now on the table. The Secretary John Kerry has even acknowledged it. It's, of course, the U.S. envoy on climate change. So it's now on the agenda. I think the second issue is how do we build resiliency in the system? And we've seen the devastating flooding that's going on in Nigeria. We need to expect we're going to continue to have these extreme climate events. We can't stop them in the short term. So how do you build resiliency into communities so they can cope with large volumes of water without loss of life, without loss of huge amounts of property on that? So I think those are the two agenda items that I think the president has to have in their engaging with the rest of the world on climate justice, climate reparations, and make sure Africa and Nigeria doesn't suffer more than it already has. And two, how do we build the resilience for the fact that climate is changing into the flooding situation, into loss of vegetation, Lagos, which is, of course, very low-lying area. So lots of issues. Those are the two things I'd focus on.
I must thank you so much, Dr. Andrew Nevin, Chief Economist Partner, PricewaterhouseCoopers Nigeria, always there to break it down, make us understand the issues better on Business Nigeria. Thank you for your contribution. We appreciate this.
Thank you, Tolo.